thank everyone for coming to this year's edition of the Phyllis of the Jim Brown Memorial Lecture. And this year we are pleased to have Gerard Gawalt come to us. He used to be a researcher at the Library of Congress. He specializes in presidential biographies, amongst other things, but his latest book out is called Fire and Ice, and it's about Henry and Lucy Knox and the founding of Maine. So thank you for coming, and we're happy to have you.
Well, that's almost as good an introduction as one time I was introduced as the President of the United States. But that's a different story. You can ask me after this thing, I'll tell you about it. But anyway, the settling of Maine was not an easy thing to do. The weather is harsh, the soil is rocky, the water is cold, and in the 18th century, the natives, both Europeans and indigenous people, were not very friendly. But Henry and Lucy Knox were two people who tried to settle Maine, partly because they wanted to make money. But Henry Knox was born in Boston in either 1749 or 1750, because two people by the name of Henry Knox were baptized 1 year after the other. Apparently, possibly his brother died, and then Henry was born, and so he was Henry II. Anyway, his father, William Knox, was a small merchant, a ship captain, and Mary Campbell, his mother, was Scotch-Irish by way of Ireland. And when Henry was about 10 years old, his father went bankrupt and sold his business, got on his boat, and sailed off to St. Eustatius, never to come back, leaving Mary Knox with 10 kids. And Henry Knox was in the middle. So at 12 years old, Henry Knox was put out as an apprentice, which was not that unusual. They put out an apprentice to a bookmaker. So he worked as an apprentice in a book business on Corn Hill until he was in his early 20s. And then he decided to open his own bookstore, which he brazenly, I would say, called it the London Bookstore in Boston. The latest of all books from London, and he opened the store. And among the customers who came in was a young 16-year-old girl called Lucy Fluker. And, well, one of the things I was deathly afraid of in publishing this book is they're going to leave an L out of this name. But fortunately, they never did, so that was good. Anyway, Lucy came in to visit the bookstore, and also to visit Henry Knox, who was a tall, handsome, garrulous, charismatic young man, although he didn't have any money. Lucy Knox's parents were extremely well connected. Her father was the secretary of the province of Massachusetts. Her mother was very rich because she was actually born Hannah Waldo. This is important because Samuel Waldo had a patent title to about 1 million acres in Maine. First, he acquired the title to the Musgunkus patent, which was first issued in 1617 to two men who have disappeared in history. But by 1730, Samuel Waldo had acquired the title by going to England a couple of times. He pulled all kinds of political strings. He was an important person. He got title to the Musgunkus patent. And then in 1745, he was the brigadier general commanding the American militia at the capture of Louisburg. And in return for that, he was given a proprietary grant to 29 square miles of Maine, which they didn't really, whoever wrote the patent didn't really understand distances in Maine, because they said the patent ran from the Madomic River, Musgunkus Bay, to the Penobscot River. Well, everybody knows that's a few more than 29 miles. But anyway, Samuel Waldo now had two titles. And Samuel Waldo died in what's now Bangor. He was marking the boundaries with the governor of Massachusetts, and supposedly he got to some place in Bangor and he said, "Here's my northern boundary," and he dropped dead of a heart attack. Anyway, but Hannah Waldo was his daughter, so Lucy Waldo Knox was his granddaughter. She was extremely rich. They fell in love. They were going to get married. They got married in 1774. Her parents refused to go to the church, so she was given away by her uncle, Isaac Winslow. The Flukers were very loyalist. They were officers of the crown. Henry Knox was a patriot, one might say, unless you're English. Then he was a traitor, but we'll just call him a patriot. And he was the volunteer commander of an artillery company in Boston. And so you have the two extremes within the family, which was not that unusual. But in 1775, we know the British decided to put down the rebellious Americans by capturing some of their leaders in Concord and Lexington and capturing military supplies. And but the British did a kind of strange thing. They were supposed to go out and secretly capture John Hancock and John Adams. They had a practice run the day before April 19th. So they marched out, the same Colonel Percy and 800 British soldiers marched out to see whether anybody would notice or shoot at them, and nobody did. So they thought, well, tomorrow we'll just march right out to Concord and Lexington and capture the supplies. Anyway, to make a long story short, we know that didn't happen. They got ambushed. They barely made it back to Boston. Henry and Lucy Knox went to Cambridge while the British were trying to get back to Boston. So they left Boston. Henry Knox brought his artillery company with him and began to set up a series of forts around Boston. So when Washington came in July of 1775, he had already set up a series of fortifications. Washington toured them and said, "Henry, you did a really good job. I like you. I don't like the guy who's now the commander of the artillery because he's 62 years old and not up to the job," they said. And Gridley's men didn't like him. So the long story short, Gridley got pushed out and Henry Knox got appointed the commander of the American artillery. And in that point, Henry had the good idea. I'm sure he wasn't the only one, but he was the one who actually did something. He convinced Washington he should go to Fort Ticonderoga, get the cannons that were captured at Fort Ticonderoga, bring them back to Boston, and set them up around Boston and force the British to evacuate. So Henry and his brother William went out to Fort Ticonderoga. They brought back 52 cannons, a lot of powder, cannonballs. They had 42 sleds with oxen pulling them. Anyway, they made it back. There was a council of war. All the American officers voted to have Henry put his cannons up on Dorchester Height and would convince the British they had to lose or they'd get blown out of the water. So they put the cannons up there on March 16th. The British looked at them and said, "Oh, we got to do something." So they tried to attack the Dorchester Heights, but there was a big snowstorm. They turned back. But the thing is that even though Henry and George got all the credit for chasing the British out of Boston, it turns out the British had already planned to leave Boston. because it was too small for the big British fleet that was coming, and they thought New York was the center of the colonies, so they were going to New York anyway. But they've celebrated Evacuation Day in Boston ever since on March 17th, although for the last 100 years that's kind of been overshadowed by St. Patrick's Day, which happens to fall on the same day. So anyway, it's a joint celebration. Henry and Lucy, Lucy followed Henry to the camp, one of many in Cambridge. She traveled with him all the way through the war. Henry Knox was the commander of artillery, so he went with the army to New York. Long Island they lost at White Plains. They marched down, retreated to Pennsylvania. Henry was with them when they recrossed the Delaware and defeated the British at Trenton, and then at Princeton, and then they went into winter quarters. And then Henry and Lucy went, when the British went towards Philadelphia, the American army went south. They met the British at Brandywine, they lost there. They met the British at Germantown, they lost there. And then the British next year evacuated Philadelphia, marched across New Jersey. The Americans finally defeated the British at Monmouth Courthouse. Henry got a lot of credit for his the cannon work. And he then followed Washington all the way down to Yorktown and beyond. And Lucy was with him. Lucy and Henry had 13 children. So not only was Lucy going from one military camp to another, she was also having a child just about every year. And only 3 of their children lived to adulthood. William, who changed his name to Henry, and is basically known as Henry Jackson Knox, and 2 daughters, Caroline and Lucy. Anyway, at the end of the war, the Americans had their independence. Henry Knox was left to send the army home, and Washington went back to Mount Vernon. Henry was hoping to get an appointment with the new government. He wanted to be the secretary at war, which he eventually came, but at the end of the war, he didn't want to go back to being a bookseller. That seemed very calm. So he wrote to Washington and said, I have to find something to do because I need money. And this $2,000 salary at Secretary of War just not going to be enough. Even though the average person in 1784 was making about $90 a year. Apparently $2,000 was not enough for Henry and Lucy. But he said, so I have only one alternative, and as Lucy owns a lot of land in Maine, if we can just get the title to it. Problem was that it was royal grants, and now they were independent. So most people said, I don't think those proprietary grants are any good. But Henry and Lucy said, oh, I think they are, and we're going to prove it. So they set about, I would say, using political influence and contacts to get the right appointments. In 1784, Henry Knox came to Maine as a representative of Massachusetts to convince the Penobscot Indians that they should move from the tidal part of the Penobscot River up beyond the falls of the river, which Henry did. And the natives got 350 blankets and a barrel of gunpowder. And Henry, who had, of course, no interest in this, even though he's going to claim all this land south of it, got to move the Indians off what he thought would be his land. And so it's a very complicated, difficult story about how they got from a military, royal patent to actually owning the land. But I'll try to simplify it. It's 20 pages in my book, but I don't think you want to hear all the details. But let's put it this way. Henry and his friends, the Massachusetts legislature appointed Henry as their agent to sell the loyalist property that had been owned by Thomas Fluker, Henry's father-in-law, who had died. And the Massachusetts had tried selling the land in Maine by small lots, and they weren't getting very successful. So Henry was appointed as the agent to sell the Fluker property, and he sold it to a friend, Oliver Smith, and then subsequently, this was in 1788. In 1790, Oliver Smith sold the land to Henry Jackson, who was Knox's agent, and Jackson then sold it to Henry Knox for $5,100. So now he's got 1,000,000 acres for $5,100. And the beauty for Henry Knox was he got paid by the Massachusetts legislature for selling the property essentially to himself. So 2 for 1 for Henry. So he has, it took him basically 3 years to go through this whole process. And then in the meantime, he came to Maine, or was then called the Eastern District, or the Don Land if you were an Indian, in 1788, and tried to get the European settlers who were here to pay him for land that they had already thought they had paid for somebody else, or they had just settled on it and thought they owned it. And Henry Knox, that in 1788, Henry Knox and his agents convinced hundreds of people in what's now Mid-Coast Maine to agree to buy the land that they had already developed or thought they had bought from somebody else. Long story short, they all agreed to do this. Most of them never paid for it. I'll give you an example. There was a man by the name of Joseph Martin who bought land in what's now Stockton Springs, which is not too far away. Anyway, he bought the land from 2 men who had bought it from Samuel Waldo's heirs before the war. But the 2 men had never paid for the land that they had bought, so they had sold it to this man Martin, and Martin settled on it and was after the war and was very surprised when Henry's agents showed up and wanted him to pay for the land once again. So Martin didn't agree. He petitioned the Massachusetts legislature in 1790. The legislature answered in 1797 and said, yeah, you've got to pay General Knox $170 for your 200 acres. Well, so this is how complicated it gets. Henry Knox never got the money. Joseph Martin wrote to him 3 years later and said, I can't afford to pay you the money, and kind of sat there. Henry Knox eventually died. Joseph Martin ended up, by 1811, he was down to 50 acres. By 1818, he was living off his Revolutionary War pension. He had lost the title to the land, which he never had, because he never actually paid for it. But this went on for hundreds of times, thousands of times, throughout Henry Knox's ownership of the land. To further complicate Henry Knox's land ownership, 1791, Henry Knox and William Dewar, a merchant from New York, came up with the idea of, let's buy a lot more land in Maine, because 1,000,000 acres isn't enough. So William Dewar and Henry Knox managed to convince the Massachusetts legislature to sell them up to 3 million acres. The Massachusetts legislature had passed several laws saying They were gonna sell them in lotteries, 500-acre lots, 200-acre lots. They weren't gonna sell big things. Well, Henry Knox had a friend who was the Speaker of the Massachusetts House, and he wrote to Henry and said, well, for $500 in expenses, I think we can get this measure reversed in the Massachusetts legislature. So for 500 well-placed dollars, Henry and William Dewar were allowed to buy land. No one knew exactly how many. Everything north and east of the Penobscot River to the Canadian border was what they agreed to buy. And they agreed to pay a tenth of a cent per acre. But that's still a lot of money. They agreed, they had to pay the Massachusetts legislature, Massachusetts, $270,000 by the end of the 1790s. Because Henry Knox didn't have that kind of money, he kept borrowing money. And William Dewar went bankrupt the next year and ended in debtor's prison in New York. And so now Henry and Lucy now own 3 million extra acres, which they have to pay the state of Massachusetts $25,000 a year, which they don't have. So Henry went to a friend of his that he knew from Philadelphia when he was Secretary of War, William Bingham, who was reported to be the richest man in Massachusetts, well, in the country. William Bingham agreed to take over William Dewar's half of the property, for which he paid Henry Knox $8,000 in cash and a note for $17,000 and something, which Henry was supposed to pass on to William Dewar so he could get out of debtor's prison. Well, William Dewar stayed in debtor's prison because he didn't get the money. And William Bingham owned all this land. And Henry Knox and Bingham spent hundreds of thousands of dollars improving land, surveying land, building roads. In Henry Knox's case, he started in what's now Thomaston, Maine, and he even built a canal along the St. George's River to get lumber and crops to a shipyard he started in Thomaston. And this is all going on, and at this point in 1794, Henry writes to Lucy, who had no intention of ever moving to Maine, we got to go to Maine because otherwise we're not going to make any money. I have to be there. So he's hired a man from Boston, a man by the name of Dunstan, to build a house in Thomaston, Maine. So most of it was built in Boston and shipped to Maine on boats. But he built a 19-room mansion that had 24 fireplaces. Even his agent, Henry Jackson, said, "You're crazy, this is way too expensive." Anyway, by 1795, the house was basically built. There's a replica of it now in Thomaston on Route 1, Knox Mansion Museum. Anyway, he built this huge house. I mean, it was overwhelming. It was magnificent. In Thomaston, it was ridiculous. I mean, nobody else had a 2-story house in Thomaston, never mind a 19-room gigantic mansion. Anyway, Henry was personally liked, but his policies were not liked. His agents went to court often to get people off their land if they didn't pay. There was a resistance movement known either as resistors, white Indians, whatever, that opposed Knox and the great proprietors. In the 15 years from 1790 to 1805, there were over 100 instances of violence against Henry Knox's property or his agent's property or his surveyors to try to stop them from asserting authority over the land. And Henry Knox and William Bingham, on the Bingham property, they spent almost over $400,000 to develop the land. And the Waldo Knox patent from the Penobscot South, Henry Knox, by the end of the 1790s, had spent almost $300,000, all of which he borrowed, because he wasn't collecting a lot of money. People promised to pay, but they didn't pay. He was building all these mills. He built shipyards, canals. He started a big lime kiln business, and he's shipping thousands of casks of lime out of Thomaston every year. Unfortunately, he was selling the lime cask full of lime for $1, and they essentially cost him $1.25 for each one. So he lost money on that. He had a big brick yard in which they shipped hundreds of thousands of bricks out of Thomaston, mostly to Boston. So he really developed a lot of mid-coast Maine. Trouble was, they were in debt. Even William Bingham, the richest person, supposedly in America, ran out of money. He wrote to Henry and said, we kind of run out of cash. I can't loan you any more money. So they decided where to go. The Baring Brothers Bank in London, biggest bank in the world at that time, they went to the Baring Brothers. Alexander Baring came over to negotiate a deal with Bingham and Knox, which they did, which was helped along by the fact that Alexander Baring fell in love with William Bingham's daughter Anne, and they got married. So now the family's getting bigger here, but now you've got the Baring Bingham Knox property, and they're spending money and they're not making any money. I looked at a lot of records. They're taking in money. It doesn't cover the wage. Meanwhile, Henry has got over 100 people working for him directly in the Thomaston-Warren area. For example, one month the salary for his workers was over $4,000, because Henry was generous. He was paying his workers $1 a day, which was twice the going rate. And he got a lot of people to move to Maine. Hundreds of people literally moved to mid-coast Maine to work for Knox. And it really jump-started the whole development of Maine, that part of Maine. He started a shipyard. They built 15 ships, and at the end of which, the year before his death, he wrote to his agent and said, I think we have to sell these ships because we're losing money. I mean, Henry had great ideas. A friend of his who became a U.S. Senator, Harrison Gray Otis, said, Henry's a victim of anticipation. He anticipates he's going to make all this money. He sells, borrows to produce things, and he just doesn't go anywhere with it because well, for one thing, he didn't live long enough. In 1806, he tried to clear the decks on his debts, and he settled by William Bingham. By then had died. So he settled with the Bingham heirs in exchange for their taking off the mortgages that he had owned. He gave them his share of the Bingham property. So he traded land he couldn't sell for money he had already spent. And then at the same time, he went to his bankers. People had been lending money from Boston, and he said, okay, we have all this, you have mortgages on all the land, I can't pay you, the land's yours. So in 1806, he thought he was on the clear and narrow path because he had given away most of his land or traded it for money that he had already spent, and he wrote to Lucy and said, you know, the sky's bright, morning has come, looking good. He came back to Thomaston, and he swallowed a chicken bone, they said, and it got infected, and he died from the infection. Now, some local historians have told me what really happened was that Henry got caught in bed with a neighbor's wife, the husband shot him in the throat, and that's what he died from. He had some kind of throat injury, and he died. Anyway, so he died in 1806. He thought, you know, the path was clear to prosperity, and then he died. But when he died, his estate was valued at $121,000, which is a lot of money in those days. Unfortunately, he owed $139,000. So he still, so Lucy, who actually had owned all this property, not the Bingham part, but the Waldo Knox patent, was left with the big mansion and about 40 acres of land, which she thought that she didn't owe anything on the mansion house, but it turned out that had been mortgaged too. But this guy, George Blake, wrote from Massachusetts and said, I really don't want this big house in Maine, so if you can pay me, that'd be nice. He never got paid. But anyway, she was stuck with that, and she actually, for the next, well, she died in 1824. For the next 18 years, she did a really good job of supporting herself, trying to keep things going. She leased most of the mills, the stores, to other people, the brickyard, the kilns, so she did support herself, and basically her 3 kids, because her son Henry was useless. He was a wastrel from the time he was like 13 years old. People would write to Henry and say, I don't want you to spend any more money on your son. I'm not giving him any more money because he just drinks it up. And there's a great letter that Henry Jackson wrote to him. Said, I can't give your son any more money. I caught him in the local tavern with 2 common women. And so I'm giving up. But Henry, the son, spent most of his life as an alcoholic. He married in 1802. His wife left him and moved back to Massachusetts and became a housekeeper to the bookseller Isaiah Thomas. Anyway, and that's where she ended up. Henry, the son, ended up in Thomaston in 1822. He became a born-again Christian, apparently stopped drinking, but he never did amount to anything. His parents kept giving him farms, mills, grist mills to run. He just never could do anything to do it. Lucy, the daughter Lucy married a lawyer by the name of Thatcher, and Caroline married a man by the name of James Swan, who's another interesting story of misspent money. James Swan's father was a land speculator, merchant. He went to Paris, ended up in debtor's prison in Paris. His mother, Hezekiah, or Hezbollah, there's a B when it's a woman, Hezekiah. Anyway, she ended up in Boston, and she made a lot of money investing in real estate. She partnered up with Henry Knox's agent, Henry Jackson, and Henry Jackson didn't marry her but moved in with Mrs. Swan and ended up getting buried in Mrs. Swan's garden, which is now part of the Fenway in Boston. So if you go to visit the Swan house and on the Fenway, Henry Jackson's buried in the little garden there. So, but Swan was pretty much a wastrel too, but his mother kept sending him $1,500 a year. That was his kind of pension, I guess, to stay out of her hair and stay in Maine. And when he died, Caroline got $200 a year from the Swan family. So Caroline, after James Swan died, Caroline married a lawyer by the name of Holmes, who had been Maine's first U.S. senator. They lived in Portland, and when Holmes died, Caroline moved back to the mansion in Thomaston, which she lived there until she died, and then Lucy moved into the mansion, and Lucy and her kind of farmer agent, they subdivided the 40 acres. So if you go to Thomaston now, and you go down to where the Lyman Draper shipyard is, which used to be where Henry Knox's mansion was. It's not up on Route 1 where they moved the faux mansion is up on Route 1. The real mansion got run over by a train, really, basically, in the 1870s. But anyway, they subdivided the property, and you can go there now, and many of the houses are still there. The streets are still there, Knox Street, Fluker Street, Thomas Street. Oh, the subdivision is still intact. And Caroline's grandson, who was named Thatcher Swan, anyway, he became an admiral during the Civil War. He sold the mansion house. It was in 1871, I think, the Rockland Railroad decided to expand the railroad up to Rockland, and apparently the best course, or the only course, I don't know which, went right through the Knox mansion. So they leveled the Knox mansion, put the railroad in. The railroad's still there. The only thing that survives of the Knox mansion that's there is the farmer's house, farm manager's house, which became the railroad station, and now it's the Thomaston Historical Society building. So that's the only actual part of the Knox establishment, which, you know, had the big mansion. It had 9 other buildings in a crescent around the mansion house. And the mansion was, I don't know how to say it, it was wildly unpopular in Thomaston because it was so big. And in the course of building it, they also managed to upset people by putting the mansion on top of the local cemetery, which meant they just leveled that, moved the stones, and that cemetery disappeared. And then subsequently, Henry gave them another piece of land that's now the cemetery, but it's not there. But that didn't enhance their popularity in Thomaston. Henry was himself personally popular. Everybody liked him. He was happy-go-lucky, went around, shook people's hands, nice, gruff guy. Lucy, on the other hand, was very unpopular. For one thing, she had used to being rich and didn't like being in Thomaston. And people thought she was a snob because the only time she talked to somebody outside the family was to tell the servants what to do. And she spent a lot of time in Boston. She liked to gamble. At one card game, she supposedly lost 3 townships in the state of Maine. She did like to play chess. People said she was very good. But she spent a lot of money. Henry spent most of his life telling her to try to curb your expenses, but that didn't do much good. Earlier in their marriage, when they were in New York, she had an allowance of 65 pounds a month, which was like somebody's yearly pay. And they had 6 servants in New York, so 2 indentured servants and 4 others. But she liked to live well. She had been brought up that way. She continued, and she managed to eke out a really prosperous living until she died. And then the whole thing fell apart. It had actually fallen apart before, but she managed to hang on. Her 2 children hung on to the mansion, and as I said, it was leveled to make a railroad track. The only thing that, if you go to the Knox Mansion Museum now, the only authentic piece of Knox there is the piano. It was bought by Lucy Knox when they were in New York in 1788. The original was still there, so that's about the only authentic piece of Henry that's in the Knox Mansion. But now we can either look at Henry's career as a total failure because he ended up without any money or lost a lot of land, or we can say he was very successful because he lived very well while he was alive. People loaned him a lot of money, which he spent, and so he gave them land which he couldn't sell in place of the money they gave him. So you could say he was very successful, because a lot of real estate people, some of whom we know well, have borrowed enormous amounts of money on property that went bankrupt, and so nothing new. Henry Knox was, in that sense, a precursor. So, but he thought he had settled everything when he died, and he died a happy person. Well, probably not happy, because nobody's happy when they die. But he was content. He thought he had settled everything up. So that's basically my story about Henry and Lucy Knox. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Sure.
What were your sources?
What are my sources?
Yeah.
Well, the Knox papers are, there are 167 volumes of Knox papers. Fortunately, they were put on a computer, and so I could access them by word search, so I didn't have to look through every piece of paper. But that was one main source. I used Thomaston Historical Society, Maine Historical Society. There were a number of books written in the early 19th century that have a lot of details about the towns of mid-coast Maine, individuals, property, mills, that sort of thing. A lot of the details are in my book. Nobody really wants to hear how many saws were in the Brewer Mill on the St. George's River. But anyway, it's in there. Henry Knox had 31 saws going on the Thomaston River at one point. And he didn't like the saws he got. He kept complaining. They kept breaking. So, anyway, yeah.
The site of the original mansion,
Mm-hmm.
why was that so why did they have to get rid of a cemetery in order to have that mansion in that particular spot? Did it overlook the ocean? Was
Yeah, it's at the mouth of where the St. George's River goes into the bay. It's on a high point because that's where the fort was.
I see.
St. George's Fort was there. And so that was the best place, great location, you know, the high ground. He built a really nice mansion. I mean, he spent an enormous amount of money. He had orchards, he had farms, he had a deer park, he had everything, you know.
Sounds like
He
a
was
king.
yeah, well, Yes, one person described the setup that, he said that Knox lives like a prince in the midst of a howling wilderness. So, yeah, I mean, he had a great setup. It just didn't work as far as making money is concerned. But anyway, it did a lot of good for Mid-Coast Maine. There's still a lot of the things that he developed there. In fact, the last, I guess, vestige, you might say, of the Knox property closed its doors. They announced they were closing yesterday. The Dragon Cement Company, which was the site of one of Henry Knox's lime operations, just closed. Another one of his lime operations was where the state prison was. So he had it all over the place. He developed a lot of things.
There's a kiln in Rockport Harbor too.
Yeah.
There's still
Yeah.
vestiges of.
Yes, that's right, yeah. So he spent a lot of money. And I don't know whether, Dover, Foxcroft was actually in another proprietary grant. It was in the, sometimes called the Vaughan Proprietary Grant or Kennebec, proprietors.
Merrick Square, right over there, named after one of them, and Bond Street.
That's right, Vaughan and Merritt, yeah.
And, basically, as you were telling your story, I was thinking all the place names in Maine
Yes.
that came out of that, Knox from Waldo County, obviously.
That's right,
The town of Knox, the town of Waldo.
right.
The town of Bingham.
Bingham? Yeah,
But also, a lot of those towns between the Mid-Coast and the Kennebec River were settled by the Liberty men from the Revolutionary War on land
yes,
that Knox thought he owned
right,
and thought they were squatting on.
right,
And that's why you get all the names of places like Unity, Freedom,
yeah,
Hope, Friendship.
yes,
They named them because
Yeah.
that's what they wanted to turn that howling wilderness into.
right.
If Knox could only just leave them alone and stop
Yeah.
them.
Well, there's a lot of interesting things where they wanted to be left alone. They didn't have any churches, there was no civil government, and they liked it that way. And so, yeah, all those towns there and up through Belfast and along the coast were the really centers of resistance. And Henry Knox and his agents, they would catch the resistors or white Indians or whatever you want to call them, and put them in jail, and the next day they would escape. There was they were very seldom brought to trial, shall we say. But it was an ongoing struggle. So I guess you would say eventually the resistors won, because most of them didn't have to pay, because in 1808, Massachusetts passed what they called the Betterment Act, which basically gave settlers, squatters, whatever you want to call them, the people who had developed land, the right to title to that land. If the proprietors wanted that property, they had to pay those settlers the amount of money equal to what they had spent to develop the land. And if otherwise, the settlers could just pay the vacant land price to the proprietor. And after that act was passed, most of them did settle up under that act because they didn't have to pay very much. The proprietors, well, Henry Knox was dead, but the proprietors went to court and said it was unconstitutional taking of their property, and the Massachusetts court said, no, it's not. So I ended up, kind of winning in the end. And one of the main reasons for the separation for Maine from Massachusetts was anger over these proprietors who had come in, starting in the 1780s, there was a whole series of meetings and referendums, conventions, in which Maine residents repeatedly voted to separate from Massachusetts. And Massachusetts legislature paid no attention to them until the late 18 teens, when, for political reasons, the Federalists thought that it would be an advantage to have another state in the Union with 2 extra senators who might be Federalists. And so there was a conjunction of people in Maine who wanted to separate from Massachusetts and national politicians who wanted another state that would offset Missouri, because that was coming in as a slave state. Anyway, that's a whole other story. And Maine still has one of the most liberal, I guess you would say, possession laws. So if you live on land and you possess it for 20 years, nobody says anything, technically it's yours. But there's always a court case. But anyway, so any other questions? No? Well, I must have done a good job because I covered all the questions. Thank you. For those of you who came late, if you had a
I thought you
question.
started at 7.